BBC News. Hello, I'm Tom Watts. President Biden has called for a ban on the sale of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in the wake of a mass shooting at a Texas primary school. In a passionate address from the White House, the president proposed raising the minimum age for buying guns and a repeal of the liability shield for gun manufacturers. Mr. Biden said mass shootings had gone down after tougher gun laws were passed by the Congress in 1994, but numbers have risen since the Republicans allowed the law to lapse. He criticized them for failing to allow more debate on the subject.
As we know, in order to get anything done in the Senate, we need a minimum of 10 Republican senators. I support the bipartisan efforts that include a small group of Democrats and Republican senators trying to find a way. But my God, the fact that the majority of the Senate Republicans don't want any of these proposals even to be debated or come up for a vote, I find unconscionable.
Nomia Iqbal is in Washington and watched Mr. Biden's speech.
It is being seen as a crisis here in America. President Biden has laid out what he wants to see happen. He wants to ban high-capacity magazines, ban assault weapons, strengthen background checks, repeal gun manufacturers' immunity from liability. In order for all of this to happen, they have to get it through the Senate. You need to get the Republicans on side to do that. The Republican Party tends to be generally very resistant to any sort of gun control because they see it as an infringement on people's right to bear arms.
On the eve of the 100th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky has said Moscow's forces have seized about a fifth of his country. He said up to 100 Ukrainian soldiers were dying each day to defend against Russia's push to control eastern Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky restated that the supply of more Western weapons would turn the war's outcome in Ukraine's favor. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has signed a $1.3 billion land compensation deal with the Siksika First Nation to right what he called a wrong of the past. In 1910, the federal government seized almost half of the tribe's ancestral lands in the province of Alberta for settlers. Mr. Trudeau said the government of the day ignored the wishes of the tribe's leader.
He said that he hoped that the government would be charitable to his people. But as we all know, during the 1910 surrender and subsequent actions, the government acted dishonorably.
The Siksika chief, Ore Crowfoot, said the settlement would help make his people a thriving nation, though it would not make up for past wrongs. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. A former Mexican state governor accused of embezzling public funds has been extradited from the United States. Cesar Duarte was governor of Chihuahua until 2016. He was arrested in Miami in 2020 after 2 years on the run. The former governor was accused of stealing cattle bought with state funds to help ranchers after the northern Mexican region was hit by drought. Mr. Duarte fled Mexico when prosecutors produced evidence of widespread corruption. Buckingham Palace has announced that Queen Elizabeth will miss Friday's national service of Thanksgiving at St Paul's Cathedral in London, marking her Platinum Jubilee, because of the journey and activity required. A statement said the 96-year-old monarch had greatly enjoyed Thursday's birthday parade and flypast, but experienced some discomfort. The United States has welcomed a 2-month extension to the ceasefire in Yemen, saying it brought hope to millions of Yemenis. At a news briefing, the State Department spokesman Ned Price said it was an important moment for Yemen.
We hope the parties to the conflict will seize the opportunity to take further steps to ease the suffering of Yemenis. Most importantly, we hope the parties use this opportunity to begin an inclusive, comprehensive, UN-led peace process. We know that only a durable political agreement and permanent end to the fighting can bring true relief to Yemenis.
The extension was announced by the UN Special Envoy Hans Grundberg. He said civilian casualties had reduced significantly, fuel deliveries had increased, and some flights had returned from the capital, Sanaa. The US Secretary of State has suggested religious freedom in India is being undermined by some officials in a rare criticism of Washington's long-standing ally. Antony Blinken made the remarks at the launch of the State Department's annual report on international religious freedom. But his most stringent criticisms were reserved for China, which he accused of genocide and repression of Muslim Uyghurs and other minorities. BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to the newsroom from BBC World Service with me, Janat Jalil. In an impassioned address, President Biden has implored Congress to take action that will stop the all-too-frequent mass shootings that he says have turned America's schools and other everyday places into killing fields. On Sunday, the president visited Uvalde in Texas to mourn privately with the anguished families of some of the 19 children and 2 teachers who were shot dead by an 18-year-old after he'd legally purchased assault rifles. Mr. Biden was faced with chance of do something as he left a church service. Just days earlier, another 18-year-old killed 10 black people in what seems to have been a racially motivated attack. And on Wednesday, a gunman killed 4 people at a medical center in Oklahoma. In his White House address, an exasperated President Biden listed the many attacks that have led to calls for Congress to take action, only to fail because of Republican opposition.
After Columbine, after Sandy Hook, after Charleston, after Orlando, after Las Vegas, after Parkland, nothing has been done. For God's sake, how much more carnage are we willing to accept? How many more innocent American lives must be taken before we say enough? Enough. We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And if we can't ban assault weapons, then we should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21. Strengthen background checks, enact safe storage law and red flag laws. Repeal the immunity that protects gun manufacturers from liability. Address the mental health crisis. Let us finally do something.
Our Washington correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, joins us now on the line. So, Nomia, you can really sense the frustration there. President Biden calling for immediate change to gun laws, but also careful to say the government's not out to seize anyone's guns.
Yeah, that was a very interesting moment in his speech, and I guess he feels compelled to say that because that's often the criticism that's thrown at him or any president that tries to enact gun reform. Republicans claim that it's an attempt to try, well, not many Republicans would say, well, that's an attempt to try and restrict people's rights to have access to guns. But the speech was incredibly impassioned. Behind him were 56 candles that lined his walk to the podium. They represented 50 states and 6 territories to basically show that gun violence is a problem that affects every part of this country in every single way. And the proposals that he called for are nothing new. He's called for them before. He's been here before making these sorts of appeals as a vice president, as a senator. What it all comes down to is if he can get the Republican senators on board. And he also made that the point in his speech. He said that he found it unconscionable that majority of Republican senators do not want to take any action.
So what steps exactly is he calling for?
So what he wants is, as we heard there, banning assault weapons. If he can't do that, he said he should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21, banning high-capacity magazines, strengthening background checks, and other proposals. And in order for that to get anywhere, yes, he can pass it through the House in the Congress, but in order for it to be enacted into law, it has to pass the Senate, and you need 2/3 of people to back you, so he needs Republicans on board. But they do not agree with those proposals. And in fact, the Republicans leader, the very powerful Mitch McConnell, has already said that these laws anything new has to be consistent with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. One area of bipartisanship that they do seem to be talking a lot about are the red flag laws. And these are basically laws which allow police and family members to petition state courts to remove weapons temporarily from anyone that they deem is a danger. So that's the one area. Whether or not that actually translates into any kind of legislation, we don't know. But President Biden, as we heard there, is trying to do something. He's trying to show that he cares. He's also criticised by members of his own party, by the way, for not doing enough.
But briefly, is there any sign, given all the public anguish, that this time the deadlock can be broken?
To be honest with you, say this is someone who came from Texas, Uvalde, covering it for the BBC. What you see is people get really angry after mass shootings. There's a spike in support for tougher gun laws, and most Americans want tougher gun laws. But sadly, in the end, not much happens because, as I say, you do need Republicans on board, and they are always very resistant to any kind of legislation.
Nomia, thank you. Nomia Iqbal there. It's been a day of pomp pageantry and partying as millions of people in Britain and the Commonwealth have taken part in celebrations to mark Queen Elizabeth's 70 years on the throne. Huge crowds filled the streets of central London to watch the Trooping the Colour military parade, a flypast, and the Queen smiling alongside her family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on the first of 4 days of Platinum Jubilee events. But the joy has been tempered by the announcement that the 96-year-old Queen will not attend a special church service on Friday, despite its spiritual significance to her. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
The Queen was present to light the first of some 3,000 Jubilee beacons. But in a surprise development, Buckingham Palace has said the Queen will not now be able to attend the service of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral. The reason, all the palace will say, is that the Queen experienced some discomfort when she travelled into London to appear briefly after Trooping the Colour. There'd certainly been no sign of any difficulties during the event. The Queen had appeared on the palace balcony, walking carefully and leaning on her stick. For the first time in her reign, she did not attend the parade itself. It had been left to the Prince of Wales to lead the royal party from Buckingham Palace down to Horse Guards Parade. The military parade on Horse Guards over, the crowds were allowed up the Mall towards Buckingham Palace. Overhead there was a flypast, the finest Britain's armed services could offer. The Queen, of course, has seen it all before. Her 70 years on the throne were marked in style. The Jubilee celebrations are underway, but there is uncertainty about the degree to which she will be involved.
Nicholas Witchell, well, you heard Nicholas mention there beacons being lit to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. More than 3,000 of them have been set ablaze across Britain and the Commonwealth. Australia's newly elected Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was one of the first to light a beacon in his country's capital, Canberra.
We joined 53 other nations in celebrating our common heritage, celebrating a life of service, fidelity, integrity and humanity. As we light the beacon, we give thanks for Her Majesty's long reign and send her our very warmest congratulations.
While many feel the Jubilee celebrations of a much-loved Queen have united them, feelings in some Commonwealth countries are more ambivalent. Barbados removed the Queen as head of state last year, and several other Caribbean countries have indicated they plan to follow suit. Zara Burton is a journalist in Jamaica. She says in a country dealing with a legacy of slavery and colonialism, many people feel there's nothing to celebrate.
The Queen has been representative of a colonial history that we do not appreciate in Jamaica for the most part. I would say to you that, of course, back in the day that sentiment may have been different, but over the years the sentiment has changed. And I'll just give you a sense. Back in 2012, 44%, based on a poll locally, 44% of people had support for separation from the monarchy, and that number grew in 2020 to 59%. So, you know, I would say a firm majority now want to go in the direction of separating from the monarchy.
Journalist Zara Burton. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Tom has the headlines.
President Biden has called for banning the sale of assault weapons and tougher background checks on prospective gun buyers. And Queen Elizabeth will miss Friday's service at St. Paul's Cathedral on the second day of her Platinum Jubilee celebrations.
There's growing hope that a fragile truce in Yemen may help to end the country's long-running civil war. The 2-month ceasefire between Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed pro-government forces has been extended for another 2 months. The move was welcomed by the Biden administration, a fierce critic of the kingdom in the past, which now says it appreciates Saudi Arabia's commitment to ending the conflict. The extension was announced by the UN Special Envoy to Yemen. Here's our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher.
The UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Hans Grundberg, has been crisscrossing the region, trying to nail down an extension to the ceasefire. And on the day that it expires, his efforts have finally paid off. Since the truce went into effect at the start of April, he says that Yemenis have experienced tangible benefits. These include a significant reduction in civilian casualties, an increase in urgently needed fuel deliveries at the main port of Hodeidah, and the resumption of limited commercial flights from the capital Sana'a for the first time since 2016. Not everything has been achieved. The opening of roads into the country's third biggest city, Taiz, which has been under siege by Houthi rebels for years, has not yet been implemented. But steps towards a peace process have begun, with the next 2 months now potentially providing further momentum, prompting hopes that the ceasefire might become indefinite.
Sebastian Usher, but despite the truce being extended, Yemenis are still facing what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Radia Al-Mutawakkil is a human rights worker in Yemen. She told us that suffering and violence have never really stopped.
It's a window of hope because it makes the situation less miserable. However, the war in Yemen is much more than this. So the war in Yemen is not only the airstrikes and the ground shelling. It's the fact that the state has collapsed and Yemen is controlled now by different armed groups, and the violations are still going on. So one of the things that really broke the backs of Yemenis, that millions of Yemenis in the public sector are not receiving their salaries since 2016, and this is still going on. And there are also many restrictions and violations, daily violations, like the forced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and different attacks of parties to the conflict is still going on.
Radia Al-Mutawakkil. Well, Saudi Arabia, and more specifically Saudi oil, have taken on a renewed importance on the world stage ever since the invasion of Ukraine sent global fuel prices soaring. Relations between the Biden administration and the kingdom have long been frosty in the aftermath of the killing of the dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But now, as well as extending the truce in Yemen, Saudi Arabia has agreed to step up its oil production. It's part of the cartel of major oil producers known as OPEC+, which has now said it will boost supplies by about 50%. It's thought that this will pave the way for Mr. Biden to visit Riyadh later this month as he seeks to repair relations with its leaders. Our Middle East business correspondent Samir Hashmi reports from Dubai.
The OPEC Plus cartel will pump an additional 200,000 barrels per day in the months of July and August. The decision comes after months of pressure from major oil consumers to help ease the pain of soaring energy prices. However, the increase will partially compensate for the lost output from Russia, which has fallen by about 1 million barrels per day as a result of sanctions over its invasion of Ukraine. The European Union earlier this week agreed to ban 90% of Russian oil by the end of this year. As fear grows that elevated energy prices could slow down global economic growth, the United States welcomed the OPEC Plus agreement. It also praised Saudi Arabia for playing a key role in achieving consensus within the group.
Samir Hashmi. Now, as Samir just mentioned, the European Union has committed to stopping most Russian oil imports by the end of this year. The ban is part of the latest round of EU sanctions announced against Moscow in punishment for the invasion of Ukraine. But one of Vladimir Putin's most influential allies has been spared after a last-minute intervention by Hungary. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, is a strong supporter of the war, but the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, objected to any action against him. Here's our Brussels correspondent, Jessica Parker.
Hungary had already won major concessions on the oil embargo after weeks of wrangling. EU leaders finally clinched a broad political agreement on Monday night, but ambassadors still had to approve a final legal text. At the 11th hour, Hungary intervened to stop a staunch Putin ally, Patriarch Kirill, from being added to the list of people subject to travel bans and asset freezes. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, had previously said he wouldn't support putting church leaders on the list. While there's irritation at Hungary, diplomats say the package as a whole was more important than haggling over one man. But Viktor Orban, widely seen as the EU's most Putin-friendly leader, is accused of sowing division in a bloc keen to boast unity in the face of Russian aggression.
Jessica Parker. There's deep concern in Kenya about the high number of police officers dying by suicide. Dozens have killed themselves this year alone, and hundreds more have been deemed unfit to serve because of mental health issues. It's thought that their heavy, often challenging workloads and long hours are partly to blame. Our reporter, Joyce Etutu, has been speaking to some of those affected, and you may find parts of her report distressing.
At the home she once shared with her partner Jacob and their 4 children, Immaculate Waziri is doing her daily chores. Together for 15 years, Immaculate says Jacob always dreamt of becoming a police officer. But after more than a decade in the Kenyan police force in Mombasa, Jacob took his own life.
Since it happened, I don't know who to go to. He was all I had. Sometimes he would tell me and say things were tight at work, that he didn't have time to rest, that it was too demanding, and it was back-to-back work. I used to advise him to take heart because someday something better would come along.
Like thousands of police officers here in Kenya, Jacob really struggled with his mental health. His family say they weren't aware of any issues he was facing, and that he hadn't confided in any of his friends about his problems. His partner is left to look after their children, and she's still desperately searching for answers as she's in disbelief as to how and why this happened.
Almighty God, that I will be faithful.
In the last year, there has been a high number of suicides in the National Police Service. Nearly 2,000 police officers in Kenya have been found unfit to serve due to their mental health, according to the head of the National Police Service. Dimas Kiprono is a campaign manager at Amnesty Kenya. He's been researching police mental health for the past 4 years.
We noticed that almost every week there was a case of murder-suicide or just suicide.
Amnesty Kenya recently published a report about an increase in police brutality. Dimas thinks this is partly linked to mental health problems in the force.
When officers are not well in their minds, they will use the public as outlets, and you'd notice a rise in police brutality. And so it is within our interest to ensure that police welfare, police human resource is taken care of so that they can take care of the safety and the human rights of the people of Kenya.
A task force has been set up to improve police mental health, as well as offering counselling sessions to officers. It wants to encourage a culture where colleagues can open up to each other if they're feeling down. We asked the National Police Service for comment, but they did not respond.
This is the grave.
Immaculate feels the help did not come soon enough for her partner. She hopes more will be done to support officers in the future.
That report by Joyce Etutu. Let's get the latest sports news now with Paul Serres.
The world number 1, Iga Swiatek, will face the American teenager Coco Gauff in the final of the French Open at Roland Garros after both came through their semi-finals on Thursday. It's the men's turn on Friday. Alexander Zverev takes on Rafael Nadal, and Norway's 8th seed Casper Ruud faces Marin Cilic. Football in Tunisia beat Equatorial Guinea 4-0 in their opening Africa Cup of Nations qualifier, while Mozambique and Rwanda drew 1-1. There are 4 more matches on Friday with next year's hosts Ivory Coast in action against Zambia. Golf, and Sweden's Ingrid Lindblom shot the lowest score by an amateur in women's US Open history in the first rounds of this year's championship. And Game 1 of the NBA Finals between the Golden State Warriors and the Boston Celtics is underway. The Warriors lead by 23 points to 18 in the early stages of the first quarter.
Paul, thank you. Let's return now to the war in Ukraine. In the early days of the conflict, we told you about a 15-year-old girl named Masha Feschenko. Her leg had to be amputated after it was torn apart by a blast from Russian shelling. Dr. Yuri Pozenko treated her in a children's hospital in Zaporizhia.
The girl who lost her leg was so traumatized she wouldn't eat or drink for days. She couldn't mentally handle it. We had to feed her intravenously.
It was this report on the BBC's Global News podcast that inspired a high school's choir in the US state of California to perform a song of hope for Masha. Students and their musical director worked with Ukrainian translator to record a version of Natasha Bedingfield's song Unwritten in English and Ukrainian. They told us more about the project.
My name is Cameron Davis, and I am the teacher of the high school choir at Sacramento Country Day School. I was walking. I walk every day, and I listen to the Global News podcast, and it just reminded me right away of when my older son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes the week after the world shut down for COVID, and everyone that cared about him sent a message to him in the hospital, and a local band here called Dear Darling, they sent a message to him, and they have a song called Believe in Yourself, the way I believe in you, and I just thought of that, and I wanted to share with her what had been shared with my son, because it brought him a lot of hope when he was in a very hard time in the hospital. I am unwritten, can't read my mind, I'm undefined, I'm just beginning, the pen's in my hand, ending on time.
Hi, I'm Imani Tiara. I am a freshman at the Sacramento Country Day School.
I'm Anastasia King, and I'm a sophomore at the Sacramento Country Day School. It felt like I could, and the whole entire choir, do something to help. And that really felt amazing. Like, we can do something from so far away, and it can really, really have an impact on someone.
I think coming from the standpoint of age, I couldn't imagine someone who was my age who had to go through something like this. And I was really grateful that I could take a part in this project to show my support and hopefully to give strength to anyone who needs it.
I loved getting to learn another language. It touched me because everyone else could hear what we really wanted to share to Masha and to anyone in her situation, and it felt like we could do something by giving her that message.
I cannot believe that someone has to go through this, no matter who they are, where they are. I hope that she understands that there are so many people across the world in support of her, and I hope that she continues to carry on with as much strength as she possibly can, and I hope that she can get through this and the world can come to peace soon.
Members of a US high school choir talking about their song of hope for 15-year-old Masha and the many others like her whose lives have been torn apart by the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much for listening to the newsroom here on the BBC World Service. Our next edition is at 3 hours GMT. A summary is next.
This is the BBC World Service with a true political murder mystery from the Middle East.
1974, Beirut, Lebanon. It's 9 o'clock in the evening. A car pulls up to a red light. Without warning, the passenger is shot at from another car. The shooter quickly disappears. Shortly after, the man is pronounced dead. The assassination of Mohammed Nauman, North Yemen's former foreign minister, was never solved. That man was my grandfather, and I want to find out who killed him.
He was like a professional politician who loved his country and who fought for it. He had more enemies than friends.
It's a true crime story, but I should warn you, this won't be straightforward. I'm May Norman, a BBC journalist, and this is Who Killed My Grandfather.
At bbcworldservice.com.
I'm Manny Jasmy. In this week's World Football, commiserations for Pat Nevin after Scotland's defeat by Ukraine. We'll look forward to Ukraine's next decisive World Cup qualifier against Wales, who haven't been at the tournament for 64 years. We'll hear from 87-year-old Cliff Jones, who played for them in 1958. And the club owned by former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has been promoted to Italy's top division. We'll hear about Berlusconi's plans for Monza. Join us